Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're diving into an emotional new chapter as the CEO returns to the place where he and Tieu Lac first confessed their love, and suddenly remembers their first kiss. But the biggest shock comes when he recalls one painful promise. Tomorrow I'll take you and our daughter away. So why did he never return, and what dangerous secret stopped him that night? Stay until the end to find out. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The rain began just as the CEO and Tieu Lac were leaving the far end of the strawberry fields. At first, it was only a light drizzle. Tieu Lac looked up at the dark sky and immediately quickened her pace. "We should go back." The CEO glanced toward the village road. "We won't make it before the rain gets worse." As if the sky had heard him, thunder rolled across the hills. A few seconds later, heavy rain poured down. Tieu Lac covered her head with one hand. "There's an old shelter nearby." "Where?" She pointed toward a narrow path between the trees. "Come on." They ran through the rain. The ground quickly became muddy, and the CEO nearly slipped more than once. On the second time, Tieu Lac instinctively grabbed his arm. "Careful." He looked at her hand. She immediately let go. The CEO smiled faintly. "You've said that to me before." Tieu Lac kept walking. "I've probably said it to everyone." "No." He followed her. It felt familiar. She didn't answer. A few minutes later, they reached a small wooden shelter built beside a low hill. The roof was old, but it was still strong enough to keep most of the rain out. The CEO stepped inside, then stopped. Something about the place felt strange, not unfamiliar. The opposite, too familiar. There was an old wooden bench near the wall, a narrow opening overlooking the fields, and one crooked wooden post covered with faded scratches. The CEO slowly approached it. His fingers moved across the wood. Two initials had been carved there years ago. Almost erased now. He stared at them. Tieu Lac. She was standing near the entrance, shaking rainwater from her sleeves. "What? Have I been here before?" Her movements stopped. The CEO looked at her. "You know the answer." Tieu Lac took a slow breath. "Yes." His heart beat faster. "With you?" "Yes." He touched the carving again. "Did I do this?" Tieu Lac looked away. "You told me you wanted to remember on your own. That doesn't mean you have to hide every detail." She gave him a tired look. "I'm not hiding it." "Then tell me what happened here." For several seconds, she said nothing. Outside, the rain became heavier, drumming against the roof. Finally, Tieu Lac walked toward the bench. "This is where you told me you liked me." The CEO froze. "Here?" "Yes." "In the middle of a storm?" "You always had terrible timing." He almost laughed. "That sounds like me." "You wouldn't stop talking." "What did I say?" Tieu Lac sat on one end of the bench. "You said you didn't know when it happened." The CEO slowly sat on the other end. "And?" "You said you had tried not to like me." His chest tightened. A sudden image flashed through his mind. This shelter. Rain. A younger Tieu Lac sitting beside him, her hair wet against her face. Then his own voice. "I don't know when it happened." The memory vanished. The CEO inhaled sharply. Tieu Lac turned. "What happened?" "I saw it." Her expression changed. "You?" "Here." He looked around. "You were sitting exactly there." Tieu Lac said nothing. "And I said I didn't know when it happened." Her eyes slowly filled with emotion. The CEO closed his eyes. Another fragment came. "I think about you when I'm in the city." Then Tieu Lac's voice. "Then stop thinking about me." His own answer followed. "I tried." The CEO opened his eyes. "I remember." Tieu Lac stared at him. "What?" "I told you I thought about you when I was in the city." Her breathing changed. And you told me to stop. A faint smile appeared on her face. What did you say after that? The CEO looked at her. I said I tried. Tieu Lac lowered her eyes. The CEO felt a strange warmth in his chest. For once, the memory wasn't frightening. It wasn't connected to his mother, the company, or the accident. It was just them. Then another image came, stronger, his hand touching Tieu Lac's cheek. Her nervous expression, the sound of rain behind them, their faces moving closer. A kiss. The CEO suddenly stood. Tieu Lac looked up. What is it? He stared at her. Our first kiss. Her face changed instantly. It happened here. Tieu Lac slowly stood. Yes. The CEO could still feel the memory, the hesitation, her hand gripping the front of his shirt. The way she pulled back for half a second, then kissed him again. For the first time, he wasn't imagining something because someone had described it. He remembered it. He remembered her. The CEO stepped closer. Tieu Lac didn't move. He took another step. Their faces were only inches apart. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain seemed to disappear beneath the sound of his heartbeat. The CEO slowly raised one hand. Tieu Lac's eyes filled with tears. He leaned toward her, but before he could touch her, she stepped back. The CEO stopped immediately. Tieu Lac? She shook her head. No. His expression changed. I know. She wiped her eyes. You remembered our first kiss? Yes. And now you want to kiss me again? It's not because I feel sorry for you. How do you know? The question stopped him. Tieu Lac looked directly into his eyes. I want you to remember me. Her voice trembled. I want you to remember why you loved me, why you stayed here, why you kept coming back. The CEO said nothing. But I don't want you to love me because you feel guilty. I don't. Maybe you don't know yet. She stepped farther away. You've forgotten years of our life. You've forgotten our daughter growing up. A tear rolled down her cheek. I don't want your pity to become something you call love. The CEO lowered his eyes. Tieu Lac continued. If you ever choose me again, I need to know it's because you truly want me. The CEO couldn't answer, because for once, there was no answer he could prove. Then his eyes fell on the old carved initials. Suddenly, another memory struck him. This one was completely different. Night, the same shelter. Tieu Lac holding their daughter in her arms, his own face tense, his hands gripping hers. Then his voice came back with terrifying clarity. Tomorrow, I'm taking you and our daughter away. The CEO staggered backward. Tieu Lac immediately moved toward him. What happened? His face had gone pale. I remember something. What? He looked at her. The night before my accident. Tieu Lac froze. The CEO swallowed. I told you. His voice broke. Tomorrow I'm taking you and our daughter away. Tieu Lac's eyes filled instantly. She remembered those words perfectly. She had packed a small bag that night. She had waited for him the next morning. Then noon. Then evening. But he never came. The CEO stared at her as one final realization settled over him. He had never planned to abandon them. That tomorrow had been real. It simply never arrived. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain continued falling outside the old shelter, but the CEO barely heard it anymore. Only one sentence remained in his mind. Tomorrow, I'm taking you and our daughter away. He had said it. He remembered saying it. And Tieu Lac remembered waiting for him. The CEO slowly sat down on the bench. What happened the next morning? Tieu Lac looked toward the rain. You didn't come. He lowered his eyes. I know. No, you remember the promise now. You don't remember the waiting. Her voice wasn't angry. That somehow made it hurt more. I woke up before sunrise. She sat beside him, leaving a small distance between them. I packed clothes for our daughter. A few things for myself. The CEO looked at her. You were really ready to leave? Tieu Lac gave him a sad smile. My bag was beside the door. His chest tightened. Where did you think we were going? You never told me. Another fragment came back. His own voice. Somewhere they can't control us. The CEO froze. Tieu Lac, she looked at him. I remember saying we had to go somewhere my family couldn't control us. Her expression changed. Yes. What did you say? I asked if running away would really solve anything. And me? You said staying would be worse. The CEO closed his eyes. The memory sharpened. Tieu Lac holding their daughter, her face worried, his own hands shaking slightly. Then another sentence returned. If I stay, they'll use you against me. The CEO opened his eyes. They were threatening you. Tieu Lac frowned. What? I told you they would use you and our daughter against me. She went still. You never explained what that meant. Did I look afraid? Tieu Lac hesitated. Yes. The CEO stared at the floor. That mattered. Before the accident, he hadn't simply been fighting with his mother over love. Something else had been happening. Something dangerous. What did I do after I left you here that night? You said you had one thing left to finish. What thing? You wouldn't tell me. The CEO stood and began pacing. One thing. He repeated the words as though they might unlock another memory. I had one thing left to finish, and then I was coming back for both of you. Tieu Lac nodded. That was the last thing you said. The CEO stopped. Another flash. A phone screen. An unknown message. A photograph. Tieu Lac standing outside the house. Their daughter beside her. The picture had clearly been taken from far away. Underneath it, "Stop digging." The CEO grabbed the wooden post. Tieu Lac immediately stood. What happened? He looked at her. They sent me a photo of you. Her face went pale. What photo? You and our daughter. His breathing became heavier. Someone was watching you. Tieu Lac instinctively looked toward the open fields outside. Even though the photograph had been taken years ago, the realization still made her uneasy. Why would anyone watch us? To scare me. The CEO swallowed. I think I was investigating something before the accident. The company? Yes. He remembered the strange financial records, the flash drive, the secret meeting, the board member, the missing technician. Everything was beginning to connect. Tieu Lac watched him carefully. So when you told me we were leaving, it wasn't only because of my mother. No. The CEO looked toward her. I was trying to get you away from whatever I had discovered. Tieu Lac's eyes filled again. All these years, she had believed that Promise had failed because he had chosen another life. Now she was beginning to understand that he might have been trying to save theirs. The rain slowly began to weaken. Tieu Lac walked to the opening of the shelter. The worst part wasn't that you didn't come. The CEO looked at her. What was? That I kept making excuses for you. Her voice became quiet. At 8 in the morning, I thought you were delayed. At noon, I thought your mother had stopped you. At night, I thought maybe you had changed your mind. She wiped her eyes. Then your mother came. The CEO's jaw tightened. What did she tell you? That you had finally understood your responsibilities. Tieu Lac gave a bitter laugh. She said you had decided not to throw away your future for me. The CEO looked down. And then? A few hours later, we heard about your accident. Silence. The CEO slowly moved closer. I'm sorry. Tieu Lac shook her head. Don't apologize for something you don't remember doing. I remember enough now. No. She looked at him. You remember the promise? Her voice softened. You still don't remember why you couldn't keep it. That was true. And until he knew that, the wound between them would remain unfinished. The CEO nodded. Then I'll find out. Tieu Lac studied his face. Just don't disappear into the investigation again. He almost smiled. You say that like I have a habit. You do. For the first time, there was warmth beneath her words. Then the CEO looked toward the old wooden post again. Something else pulled at his memory. Not the kiss, not the promise. A hiding place. He walked toward the back corner of the shelter and crouched. What are you doing? I don't know yet. He pressed his hand against one of the lower boards. Nothing. Then another. It moved slightly. The CEO's breathing changed. I've done this before. He pulled the board loose. Behind it was an empty, narrow space. Tieu Lac frowned. There's nothing there. The CEO stared inside. Then another memory came. Not this shelter. Her house. The storage room. A loose floorboard. His hand pushing something underneath it. He stood suddenly. We need to go back. To the house? Yes. They hurried through the fading rain. By the time they reached the house, both were soaked. Their daughter was asleep in another room with Tieu Lac's mother. The CEO went directly to the storage area. Tieu Lac followed. He moved 2 boxes aside and knelt. Then he pressed against an old floorboard. It shifted. Tieu Lac's eyes widened. The CEO lifted it. Beneath the floor was a small cloth-wrapped package. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was an old phone and a metal key. Tieu Lac whispered, "You hid this?" "I think so." He turned the key over. A number was engraved on it. 317. The moment he saw it, another memory hit. A private locker room, his hand placing a flash drive inside a metal box. Locker 317. The CEO stared at the key. Tieu Lac watched his expression. What does it open? He slowly looked at her. The thing I was trying to protect before the accident. What thing? The evidence. Silence filled the room. The CEO closed his fist around the key. The promise he had made now felt even more painful. Tomorrow I'll take you and our daughter away. He had meant every word, but before he could return, he had hidden something dangerous enough to make someone follow him. And now, years later, the key to that missing truth was finally back in his hand. The CEO and Tieu Lac are caught in heavy rain and take shelter at the place where they first confessed their feelings. Surrounded by familiar details, the CEO suddenly remembers their first kiss and instinctively moves closer to Tieu Lac. But she steps back, insisting that she wants him to remember and truly choose her, not love her out of guilt or pity. Then a stronger memory returns. The night before his accident, he promised, "Tomorrow I'll take you and our daughter away." Tieu Lac reveals that she packed a bag and waited, but he never came. As more memories surface, the CEO realizes someone had been watching and threatening them. Back at the house, he discovers an old phone and a key marked 317, triggering another memory of a hidden locker containing evidence connected to the dangerous secret behind his accident.